Example 4 is a word problem. Person stands on a cliff 55 meters high, throws a stone up in the air, and the stone hits the water a few seconds later. And they give us the equation. Now, it's important to sort of visualize this both as what's happening. So here I'm going to draw a cliff with some water, and a stone is getting thrown up in the air, and then eventually, definitely have to make a splash, hitting the water at the bottom. They give us an equation, but we have to interpret this equation a little bit as well. They tell us the cliff is 55 meters high, and they give us a formula with height and time. So if height is our independent variable, we would have some sort of graph where height was here and time was here. Does it make sense that at time 0 in this equation, if I put in 0 for time, I get 55 for height? So we're starting at 55. This rock is going up in the air and hitting the ground at some time, or hitting the water at some time later. Does it make sense that when it hits the water, we know what the height is? The height is going to be 0 when it hits the water. So again, drawing the picture, analyzing the question, I plugged in time as 0, I confirmed that, we're starting at 55 meters above the ground. We want to find out when. So if this is time here, we are trying to find out when does it hit there. Well, how can we set that up in our equation? They gave us the equation. We can plug in 0 for the height in that equation, and we have negative 5t squared plus 30t plus 55. And notice how I decided to rewrite it with the t squared first? Because if I have a quadratic equation, we always write t squared, then t, then the number. So I just rearranged my equation to say that. And whether or not I'm going to be factoring or completing the square, I can divide everything by a negative 5. So if you divide one side by negative 5, you divide the other side by negative 5, and dividing this whole side by negative 5 is like dividing each thing by a negative 5. That's nice to do because then I just get a t squared minus 6t minus 11. Ask yourself, how quickly can you go through all the options of factoring in your head to confirm that this does not factor? Because that's a mental math skill that you want to be able to have. To be able to look at this, and in your head, you don't even have to draw this down, but in your head you'd be like, I know this is t and t. And to get an 11, the only whole numbers that give me 11 are 1 and 11. Can you check that your outside and inside never would make 6? Could you do that just in your head, or would you need to write it off on the side? Eventually, you'd want to be able to do this in your head to be like, I can't factor. So what is my other way of solving? I need to complete the square. What was the idea for completing the square? I'm going to move the 11 to this side. I'm going to put a space here, and then I'd have to put a space here. And the minus 6 is my hint. And if I FOIL this out, my outside and inside to get a minus 6 has to be a minus 3. And most of you are starting to recognize that that number is always half of that middle number when you square something. Now, if there's a minus 3 there, and I squared it, would I have a plus or a minus 9 at the end? Minus 3 times minus 3? I have a plus 9, which means I have a plus 9 on this side, and that adds up to 20. Square root both sides. Oops. If I square root the t minus 3, are you okay if I just write that on the left instead of the right? You can switch sides of your equation. And if I square root the other side, I remember the plus or minus, square root of 20. I can move the 3 over, and of course I'd have to reduce the square root of 20 to lowest terms. And I get 3 plus or minus the 2 root 5. However, this is a word problem. In a word problem, you have to also analyze your answers for reasonableness. Also, does the question ask, oh, it asks you to round it. So, if I take these answers and I round them, so I go to my calculator, here's the calculator question. Okay. Pull up my calculator. If I do 3 plus square root of 20 and 3 minus square root of 20, or I could write 2 root 5. I get an answer of 7.5 and negative 1.5. In the context of the question, does it make sense that we have to cancel the negative answer out? Because if I accept that negative answer, it says that I'm on the top of a cliff. I throw a stone from the top of the cliff and it hits the water 1.5 seconds before I threw it. That's what that means. And that's very hard to visualize that that could possibly happen. I guess the only way it could possibly happen is if you were like in the water, grabbed the stone, quickly went up the cliff in 1.5 seconds and threw it again. But that doesn't make sense. Second, in this question, if I would circle this as my final answer, I would also lose a half a mark for missing something. What am I missing?
Squiggly equals.
Squiggly equals, that's not bad. They won't take off a half a mark for that, but that would be good to have because I'm approximating. Units. This question has units, so we need to include, that is an ugly looking S. It is not an ugly looking 5, but we need to have our units there as well. So you need to have units if there's a word problem, and a word problem you need to analyze it to make sure that in the context of the question, your answers make sense. So questions for practice are 6 and 7.